What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected and commanding actors walks into a television studio expecting a routine, friendly interview, only to find himself caught in a tense and relentless confrontation that pushes his patience to the absolute limit? It's the kind of moment that transforms a normal promotional appearance into something unforgettable, a clash that leaves everyone watching in stunned silence. On this particular day, what began as a typical stop on a press tour quickly turned into a dramatic exchange that few people in the studio were prepared for. By the end of it, the atmosphere had completely changed, and the audience could feel the tension hanging in the air. The actor at the center of the moment was Samuel L. Jackson, a legendary figure in Hollywood known for his commanding presence, unmistakable voice, and a career that has spanned decades. With iconic roles in films like Pulp Fiction, The Avengers, and countless others, Jackson has earned a reputation not only as one of the most talented performers in the industry, but also as someone who does not shy away from speaking his mind. That honesty has often made his interviews entertaining, but it has also meant that when a conversation turns confrontational, Jackson is not the type to quietly sit back and take it. On this particular occasion, Jackson had agreed to appear on the well-known daytime talk show The View to promote his latest film project. Appearances like this are a common part of Hollywood's promotional circuit. Actors travel from studio to studio, answering questions about their work, sharing funny behind-the-scenes stories, and connecting with audiences who watch daytime television across the country. Usually, these segments are lighthearted and relaxed. Hosts exchange jokes with their guests, the audience laughs along, and the conversation moves smoothly from one topic to the next. When Jackson arrived at the studio that morning, everything seemed completely normal. The bright lights illuminated the set, the cameras were positioned carefully around the stage, and the audience buzzed with excitement. Production assistants moved quietly around the studio floor, making last-minute adjustments while the hosts prepared for the segment. To everyone watching, it looked like another ordinary broadcast. Among the hosts sitting at the table was Joy Behar, a longtime co-host of The View known for her sharp humor, outspoken personality, and willingness to challenge guests during interviews. Over the years, Behar has built a reputation for asking direct questions and occasionally pushing conversations into uncomfortable territory. For some guests, that approach leads to lively debates that make great television. For others, however, it can create moments of visible tension. At first, Jackson appeared relaxed as he took his seat on the set. He greeted the hosts politely, flashed a quick smile to the audience, and settled into the rhythm of the conversation. The opening moments followed the familiar pattern of a promotional interview. The hosts mentioned his latest film, complimented his long career, and asked a few basic questions about the project he was there to discuss. Jackson responded with the calm confidence fans have come to expect from him, occasionally adding a bit of humor that drew laughter from the audience. But as the interview progressed, the tone of the conversation slowly began to shift. What had started as a friendly discussion about his new movie gradually moved toward more pointed questions. The energy in the room changed almost imperceptibly. At first, like the subtle tension before a storm. Some members of the audience began exchanging curious glances as they sensed that the interview was taking a different direction than usual. Joy Behar leaned forward slightly in her chair, her expression sharpening as she prepared to ask another question. Her voice carried the kind of tone that longtime viewers of the show recognized immediately, the tone that often signaled a more challenging line of conversation. Rather than focusing only on Jackson's latest film, she began steering the discussion toward topics that felt more personal and potentially controversial. Jackson listened carefully at first, responding politely while maintaining his composed demeanor. Years of experience in the public eye had taught him how to handle difficult questions without losing his cool. Yet as the exchange continued, it became increasingly clear that the conversation was no longer following the easygoing script he had expected when he agreed to appear on the show. The audience in the studio grew noticeably quieter. Even the other hosts seemed to sense the tension building between the guest and the interviewer. Cameras continued rolling, capturing every subtle change in body language. The way Jackson shifted slightly in his seat, the tightening of his expression, the pause before he answered each new question. what had been planned as a simple promotional stop was beginning to feel more like an interrogation. Jackson had walked into the studio expecting a lively but friendly conversation about his work and the film he was promoting. Instead, he now found himself navigating a series of questions that seemed designed to push him further and further into uncomfortable territory. Each new question added another layer of pressure, and the atmosphere on the set grew heavier with every passing moment. For viewers watching at home and the audience seated just a few feet away, it was clear that something unusual was unfolding. Interviews on daytime television rarely escalate into tense confrontations, but this one was beginning to feel different, and as the exchange continued, it became increasingly clear that Samuel L. Jackson was reaching the point where he had finally had enough. His patience, which had carried him calmly through countless interviews over the years, was beginning to wear thin. The calm smile that had greeted the audience earlier had faded, replaced by a more serious expression. What happened next would leave the entire studio stunned and turn an ordinary interview on The View into a moment people would be talking about long after the cameras stopped rolling. The studio lights glowed brightly across the set as the cameras prepared to roll, creating the polished, energetic atmosphere that viewers of daytime television had come to expect. The audience sat quietly but eagerly, their attention fixed on the stage where the hosts and their guest were about to begin another segment. When Samuel L. Jackson stepped onto the set, there was a noticeable ripple of excitement among the crowd. After all, Jackson wasn't just another celebrity guest. He was a legendary figure in Hollywood, a performer whose voice, presence, and unforgettable roles had left a mark on generations of moviegoers. Jackson moved toward his seat with the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades in front of cameras. Interviews, press tours, and promotional appearances were nothing new to him. He had done countless talk shows throughout his career, and he understood the rhythm of these segments well. As he settled into his chair at the table, he adjusted his posture slightly and exchanged polite greetings with the hosts. His expression was relaxed, his demeanor friendly, and he seemed completely comfortable as the cameras officially began recording. The set of The View had its familiar look, bright lights, a polished desk, and the panel of hosts seated together, ready to guide the conversation. The show had built its reputation on lively discussions and sometimes spirited debates, but it also prided itself on welcoming guests warmly. At least that was the expectation most celebrities had when they walked onto the stage. Sitting at the center of the panel was Whoopi Goldberg, whose presence often set the tone for the show. As a respected actress and longtime moderator of the program, Goldberg had a way of making guests feel comfortable almost immediately. She turned toward Jackson with a welcoming smile that seemed completely genuine. "Samuel, it's wonderful to have you here," she said warmly, her voice carrying the easy familiarity of someone greeting an old friend. "Your new film looks incredible. Tell us about stepping into this character." The question was exactly the type Jackson had expected when he agreed to appear on the show. Promotional interviews usually began with simple, positive questions about the project the guest was there to discuss. It gave actors the opportunity to share their excitement about the film, talk about their experience on set, and perhaps reveal a few interesting details that might encourage viewers to watch. Jackson smiled in response, the confident grin of ice. A seasoned professional who knew how to work a room. He leaned slightly forward, speaking clearly as he began describing the role. His voice carried that familiar tone fans recognized instantly, smooth, commanding, and full of personality. He explained that the character he portrayed in the film was more complex than many people might initially expect. According to Jackson, what attracted him to the project was the depth of the role and the opportunity to explore a personality that wasn't easily defined by a single trait. He spoke about how the script immediately caught his attention when he first read it, and how the character presented challenges that made the performance exciting. As he continued talking, Jackson described the collaboration that had taken place behind the scenes during the film's production. He mentioned working closely with the director and fellow cast members, emphasizing how the entire team had contributed to shaping the final performance audiences would see on screen. For Jackson, acting was never just about memorizing lines. It was about building relationships with the people around him and finding the emotional truth within each scene. The audience listened attentively, clearly enjoying the behind-the-scenes insight. Some nodded along as he spoke, while others smiled when he added small touches of humor to his explanations. Jackson had always been known for his ability to balance seriousness with wit, and that quality made his interviews particularly engaging. Meanwhile, the other hosts at the table seemed genuinely interested in what he was saying. They exchanged glances with one another and occasionally nodded in agreement. As Jackson described the creative process behind the film, the conversation, at least for the moment, felt relaxed and positive, exactly the kind of exchange viewers expected from a daytime talk show interview. But while most of the panel appeared fully engaged in the discussion, one host seemed to carry a slightly different energy. Seated nearby was Behar, a veteran co-host known for her sharp wit and unfiltered style. Behar had been part of the show for many years, and audiences knew she was never afraid to challenge guests with direct questions. Sometimes that approach led to lively and entertaining conversations, but other times it created moments that felt noticeably tense. In front of Behar lay a stack of notes. To a casual observer, they might have looked like the standard talking points hosts use to guide interviews. But the way she glanced down at them from time to time suggested she had prepared very carefully for this conversation. Her posture was slightly more rigid than the others, and her expression seemed more analytical as she listened to Jackson speak. While Jackson described the complexity of his character and the collaborative atmosphere on set, Behar occasionally tapped her pen lightly against the papers in front of her. Her eyes moved between the notes and the guest, as though she were waiting for the right moment to jump into the conversation with a question of her own. For viewers watching closely, the contrast in energy was subtle but noticeable. The rest of the panel appeared relaxed, enjoying the early portion of the interview, while Behar seemed focused and ready to steer the conversation in a different direction when the opportunity arose. Jackson, for his part, continued speaking comfortably about the film. He explained how stepping into the character required him to explore emotions and motivations that might not be immediately obvious to audiences. He talked about rehearsals, the long days on set, and the satisfaction that comes from seeing a challenging role finally come to life on screen. His words carried the calm authority of someone who had spent decades mastering his craft. Over the years, Jackson had built a reputation not just as a charismatic performer, but as a thoughtful actor who took his work seriously. Even in a casual interview setting, that dedication to storytelling was evident. The audience seemed completely absorbed in his explanation. A few people even laughed when Jackson shared a small anecdote about one of the lighter moments that occurred during filming. For a brief time, the atmosphere in the studio felt exactly as it should during a promotional interview, friendly, engaging, and full of positive energy. Yet beneath the surface, there was a sense that the tone of the conversation might not remain this relaxed for long. As Jackson finished one of his sentences and leaned back slightly in his chair, Behar glanced once more at the notes in front of her. The papers remained neatly arranged on the table, but the way she looked at them suggested they contained questions that might steer the conversation away from the safe territory of movie promotion. For now, though, Jackson continued speaking, confidently about the role, the creative process, and the excitement of bringing the story to audiences. It was the kind of polished, thoughtful response that seasoned actors deliver effortlessly during press tours. But everyone at the table, and perhaps even some members of the audience, could sense that the conversation was still in its early stages. And as the interview moved forward, the calm beginning would soon give way to a much more intense exchange that no one in the studio would easily forget. Samuel continued speaking about his experience working on the film, explaining how important collaboration with the director had been in shaping the character he was portraying. As he talked, his voice carried the unmistakable authority and depth that audiences had come to recognize instantly. For decades, Samuel L. Jackson had been one of the most commanding presences in Hollywood. His performances were known for their intensity, their energy, and the powerful delivery that made even a single line unforgettable. That same presence now filled the studio as he described the creative process behind the film. The discussion initially moved along exactly as one would expect from a promotional interview on The View. The hosts asked questions about the preparation required for the role, the challenges that came with portraying such a layered character, and the experience of working alongside a new generation of actors. Jackson answered thoughtfully, occasionally adding a bit of humor that made the audience laugh and helped keep the mood light. He explained that preparing for the role had required more than simply memorizing lines. According to Jackson, he spent time thinking about the character's motivations, background, and emotional state. He described how he and the director had spent hours discussing small details that might never even appear directly on screen, but still influenced how the character behaved. Those conversations helped shape the performance in ways that audiences might not consciously notice, but would certainly feel. As he spoke, the audience listened attentively. Some people leaned forward in their seats, clearly interested in hearing how a veteran actor approached his craft. Others nodded when he mentioned the importance of teamwork on a film set. Jackson emphasized that no performance existed in isolation. Every actor relied on the energy and commitment of the people around them, whether it was fellow cast members, directors, or the countless crew members working behind the scenes. One of the hosts asked about the younger actors he had worked with during the production. Jackson smiled at the question and began describing how much he enjoyed collaborating with emerging talent. He said that working with younger performers often brought fresh energy to the set. Their enthusiasm reminded him why he had fallen in love with acting in the first place. He started sharing a story about a particular scene in which one of the younger actors had surprised him with an unexpectedly emotional performance. Jackson explained how moments like that made filming exciting because they forced everyone involved to elevate their own work. When actors truly committed to their roles, the entire scene could take on a life of its own. The conversation flowed smoothly. As he spoke, the hosts listened closely, occasionally asking follow-up questions that allowed him to expand on his thoughts. It was exactly the kind of relaxed and engaging discussion that viewers expected from daytime television interviews. The audience laughed when Jackson added a small joke about the long hours spent filming certain scenes. Even the production crew seemed at ease as the segment continued without any sign of tension. At the center of the panel, Whoopi Goldberg nodded thoughtfully as Jackson described his experiences. She occasionally glanced toward the audience, smiling as they reacted to his stories. For the moment, everything felt comfortable and natural, the kind of easygoing exchange that happens when a guest and hosts are genuinely enjoying the conversation. However, not everyone at the table appeared equally relaxed. Seated nearby, Behar watched the discussion closely. Throughout the earlier part of the interview, she had remained relatively quiet, occasionally glancing down at the notes placed neatly in front of her. While the other hosts seemed content to let the conversation unfold casually, Behar's posture suggested she was preparing to guide it in a different direction. As Jackson continued speaking about working with younger actors, he had just begun describing another moment from the set when Behar suddenly leaned forward in her chair. The movement was small, but it immediately drew attention. Her expression shifted slightly, becoming more focused, almost serious. The subtle change in body language seemed to ripple across the table. Jackson paused briefly, noticing the movement from the corner of his eye. The audience sensed it too. The light, conversational rhythm that had filled the studio a moment earlier began to slow. Behar looked directly at Jackson, her gaze steady as she prepared to speak. Then she interrupted him mid-sentence. "Samuel, I have to ask about something that's been bothering me," she said, her voice cutting through the studio's calm atmosphere. The interruption was unexpected. Jackson had been in the middle of explaining a point about collaboration with younger actors, and the sudden shift in tone caught the attention of everyone present. The audience grew noticeably quieter, sensing that the direction of the conversation was about to change. Behar continued speaking before Jackson had the chance to finish his previous thought. "You've made a career out of playing aggressive characters," she said. Her words hung in the air for a moment. The phrasing immediately suggested that the discussion was moving away from the safe, promotional topics that had defined the interview so far, instead of talking about the new film or the creative process. The question seemed to hint at something more personal. Jackson remained still in his chair, listening carefully. Years of experience had taught him how to handle unexpected questions during interviews, but the sudden shift in tone was impossible to ignore. Around the table, the other hosts exchanged quick glances. The friendly energy that had filled the said earlier began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of curiosity and perhaps a little concern about where the conversation was heading. In the audience, people who had been laughing only moments earlier now watched silently. The room felt different, as if the temperature had dropped a few degrees. Behar's question had transformed the mood of the interview in an instant. What had started as a relaxed discussion about acting and filmmaking was now beginning to feel like something else entirely. The conversation was no longer simply about a movie or a character on screen. Instead, it seemed poised to turn into a deeper and potentially more uncomfortable exchange that would test the patience and composure of one of Hollywood's most formidable actors. And as Samuel L. Jackson prepared to respond, everyone in the studio seemed to realize that the interview had just crossed into very different territory.